Good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Great to be with you. Listen, do not forget the February three-book special, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings, which, by the way, has a fantastic special study of the direct parallels between the Olivet Discourse and Thessalonians. You know, scholars have recognized these parallels for forever, but, you know, they just fail to see the direct implication of those direct parallels. Anyway, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings. The book on 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 and Flaming Fire, which, by the way, is a direct commentary on Matthew 24, 29 to 31, and the last days identified. Let me reiterate, folks, if we're not in the last days, there is no futurist eschatology. Regular price for these books, all three of them, if you bought them separately, would be almost $60, but for February 2020, U.S. orders only, total delivered price, $40. There's a banner on my website to make it easy to order. Now, we are continuing our examination of that language of Matthew 24, 29 and following. Let me reiterate something here. When Jesus said, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be dark and the moon will be turned to blood, the stars of heaven shall not give its light. That language is either literal or it's metaphoric. If it is literal, then it obviously has not been fulfilled. However, I've been demonstrating for you and with you that this language is typical Hebraic, apocalyptic, metaphoric, hyperbolic, exaggerated language. It was never intended to be taken literally. I have said this a gazillion times. When we try to impose a Western literalistic worldview of literalism onto the ancient Hebraic text, we are doing a tremendous disservice to exegesis and hermeneutic. There is a vast difference in the way the Hebrews looked at the world and expressed themselves about the world from that of the Greek worldview. And you know what? Amazingly enough, on Facebook just recently, I've been absolutely criticized and castigated for making that comment. Yet scholarship recognizes this. These are supposed to be scholars on Facebook, yet they criticized and condemned me for arguing what the scholars say, that there is a dramatic difference between the Hebraic worldview and the Grecian. Now, to continue. To illustrate even further, and look, you know, I'm not going to just continue ad infinitum about all of the examples from the Old Testament that could be given to describe God's actions within history. You can look at Psalms 104, 105, Psalms 97, and you can just read Jeremiah. Just read Isaiah. And you will see over and over and over and over again of how God and how the prophets described God's actions within history. And it sounds like the entire physical cosmos was going to be destroyed. In fact, every constituent element that we find linked to the coming of Christ at his, quote, second coming, unquote, the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds with a shout, in flaming fire, with the angels to gather the elect, you know, and the destruction of heaven and earth, every one of those elements is found in the Old Testament to describe the day of the Lord in the Old Testament, and yet not one time did God ever fulfill those words literally and visibly. Not one time. And let's not forget, Jesus said his coming and the judgment of all men with the angels in the kingdom was going to be in the glory of the Father. All right, next passage, and then, like I said, we're going to move on a little bit with reference to some other texts along the way. Psalms 18 with the parallel passage being 2 Samuel chapter 22. Now here's the historical context, all right? We don't want to approach the text without honoring the context. The context is Saul is chasing David, has been chasing David all over the countryside because of his jealousy. He knows David is to one day be king. His jealousy rages. And you know the story, I'm sure, of how he chases David to kill him, to eliminate that political foe. And so David speaks of that and laments that in Psalms 18. Now, I would recommend that you read 2 Samuel chapter 22 as well. There are some nuances there, some additional language there, but for ease and for time, I'm just looking at Psalms 18. So David says, "The pangs of death surrounded me. The floods of ungodliness made me afraid. The sorrows of Sheol surrounded me. The snares of death confronted me. In my distress, I called upon the Lord, and I cried out to my God." Now watch this. David's life hangs in the balance. The king and his armies are chasing him. And David says, "I prayed to the Lord. He heard my voice from his temple, and my cry came before him even to his ears." Watch. Then when? When my prayer came before the Lord, when my prayer came into his ears, then the earth shook and trembled. What? The earth shook and trembled when David prayed to the Lord. The foundations of the hills quaked and were shaken because he was angry. Smoke went up from his nostrils, and devouring fire from his mouth. Coals were kindled by it. Now wait a minute. How did David know smoke went out of Yahweh's nostrils? Does Yahweh have literal nostrils? How would you go about proving that? David is obviously speaking in human terms. Always had trouble pronouncing that word. You know what I'm talking about. God doesn't have literal physical nostrils. But David said he cried to the Lord heard him, and the earth shook, the mountains trembled, and smoke went out of the Lord's nostrils. Devouring fire came out from his mouth. So the Lord is a fire-breathing dragon. Can we not see that David is expressing him as the great poet of Israel, writing in psalms, writing in song, writing in poetry, using hyperbolic, metaphoric language? Let me reiterate what is so incredibly important. If we today, sitting here almost 3,000 years removed from David, if we impose our literalistic worldview of the world and of history, of man, and of literature onto these ancient Hebraic texts, we are doing an incredible disservice. That's not the way to do biblical exegesis. Just the other day, a very quick anecdote, and then I'll close this morning's session. Just the other day, a former apprentice ridiculed and castigated me for appealing to audience relevance. I responded by noting it is the responsibility of every Bible student to determine what a text originally meant to its original audience. And if there is a lesson to be learned and applied to us today, then to do so. That individual responded, said, well, if Preston is right, then I guess love your neighbor as yourself, since that was written to an original audience at, thousands of years ago, that doesn't apply to us because we're not the original audience. The utter desperation and the utter illogic of that kind of an argument is just staggering. My response to that was this, that this individual claims to be a scholar, by the way. This individual has evidently forgotten that some language of audience relevance is temporally delimited. That is, it's confined to a limited and specific time context, or it's covenantally delimited, limited to a people living under a given covenant. Let me illustrate very quickly, all right? I responded to this individual. God said to Noah, build an ark. So I asked this individual, how close are you to having your ark built? I mean, after all, we ignore audience relevance, right? According to him, and according to a bunch of others on that Facebook page. I asked him, the Lord said, it's Exodus chapter 34, 3 times a year, all of your males, all of your men shall appear before me in the place that I will appoint. That's Jerusalem. I asked this individual, last year, did you make your 3 yearly journeys to Jerusalem? Oh, let me see here. God said to Abraham, every man-child that is among you shall be circumcised in the foreskin on the 8th day. Whosoever is not circumcised shall be cut off out from among the people. Genesis 17. I asked this individual if they impose physical circumcision on their children and on others as well. I gave several other examples. Well, it's been well over a week and I'm still waiting for my answer. My point was, moral mandates, thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet, etc., spring from the heart and from the character of God. They are not temporally delimited, and they are not covenantally delimited. But failure to understand that certain paranesis, certain exhortations, even certain commands, failure to understand that they are limited by covenant and by time. Like the coming of the Lord has drawn near. James 5, written 2,000 years ago. What was near then, folks, cannot by the very nature of the case be near now, temporally speaking. So, we're not through with Psalms 18, all right? I kind of went off on that, but it's so important to understand these issues. So, tomorrow, Wednesday, we'll pick up our examination of Psalms 18, and let me give you a homework to read 2 Samuel chapter 22 as well, and to see how graphic the language is, to see how powerful the language is, and keeping in mind, this is talking about David being pursued by Paul, praying to the Lord and saying, the Lord heard me, the Lord answered my prayer. And yet, if we take the language literally, heaven and earth was destroyed. God came out of heaven. But we know that didn't happen literally, don't we? Thanks for joining me on this morning's Morning Musings. I'll see you on the flip side.